Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our oblong online event for Bride of the Buddha by Barbara McHugh. My name is Leif Cantrell, and I am Oblong's Digital and Events Manager, and I will be your tech host this evening. So before we begin, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. The first is that there is a Buy the Book button down in the bottom center of your screen. It will link to signed copies of Barbara's book. You'll see that right kind of next and a little bit below that button, there is an Ask a Question button. If at any point during the event while our authors are speaking, you have a question for them, please feel free to enter your question into that module or into the chat box function. And in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the event, we will open up to an audience Q&A and answer those questions. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's authors. Barbara McHugh holds a PhD and is a Buddhist practitioner with a degree in religion and literature from UC Berkeley. She is a published poet, writing coach, and book doctor. Her research for this book includes exhaustive study of Pali texts in translation and on-site explorations in India. Kirkus Reviews called her new novel, Bride of the Buddha, an intelligently conceived and artistically executed reconsideration of religious history. Joining Barbara this evening is Elizabeth Cunningham, who is best known as the author of the Maiden Chronicles, featuring a feisty Celtic Magdalene who is no one's disciple. She is also the author of numerous other novels and collections of poetry. She is currently balancing writing and a counseling practice in the Hudson Valley. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. Elizabeth, I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you, Leif, and thank you, Oblong Books. If there's anybody here from the Hudson Valley, this is my hometown bookstore. I don't live in Rhinebeck, but I've lived in the Hudson Valley, and Oblong Books has been a wonderful home for many authors for many years. And thank you for having Barbara here, and I'm lucky to be here with her. And I'm really excited to be able to share this book that I love so much, that I've read more than once now. I have lots of questions for Barbara, but I'll just say that I came to Bride of the Buddha with not knowing much at all about Buddhism, having various prejudices. Barbara, I think, is going to talk about the myth that she basically explores, takes off from, and transforms. But I want to say that I think this book is remarkable in one sense, that it invites people in who have no background in Buddhism. I'm expecting that it invites and challenges possibly people who do have a background. There's something, if you know a lot about Buddhism, she did so much research, there's so much there. And if you don't, you're welcome. You will know a lot more than you did when you began. But most of all, it's a great story. This is a great heroine. This is a feisty, human, multi-dimensional woman who's going to, it's not Buddha's story through her eyes, it's her story. And he happens to be a pretty good character. And I must say that my prejudices melted away, and I developed a respect and affection that I'd never had before. And I thank Barbara for that. And I want to say hello to Barbara again. And Barbara, do you have anything that you'd like to say before we start questions, or do you want to read the prologue, which I really want you to read?
Okay.
I'd like to say first.
I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for lavish praise. Thank you. And also thank Oblong Books for having us. And yeah, I'll read the program, the prologue. The book is about the Buddha's wife whom he abandons to go seek enlightenment. And so this is how it begins. And just also to add that the Buddha's wife in my novel, and her name is Yasodhara, and sometimes it's pronounced Yashodhara, but I read it more than I heard it said, so I call her Yasodhara or Yasi. And she had her own spiritual ambitions, but she married the Buddha instead for various reasons, not all her own. And that comes out in the book. Anyway, this is the prologue. I won't leave without your blessing, Siddhartha whispered so softly I wasn't sure he wanted me to hear. He stood in the carved rosewood doorway of our bedchamber, and in the deepening silence of my refusal, I pulled Rahula closer, praying that our 2-day-old son would feel only the beating of my heart and not the bitterness that filled it. You don't need my blessing. Just go, find your Dharma. My young husband, who would one day be called the Buddha, didn't move. He stood in the darkness across the room from our wedding bed, and I lay on my side with my back to him, staring out the window at a moon waning to a diamond white crescent. A single star, sharp as betrayal, was poised beside it. It was just before dawn. Rahula stirred against my collarbone, a small shifting warmth under the cool silk coverlet. My husband had named him Rahula, the common word for bond, but it also meant fetter. Yasi, he said, if you ask me to stay, I will. I looked at him, still standing in the doorway, but he was only a silhouette, his clear eyes and the tender curve of his lips already fading in my memory. Perhaps if I'd seen his face and it had revealed a change, I would have begged him to stay. But in recent months, his look of sadness and revulsion, at the sight of my mortal flesh and all the suffering it implied, had lodged in my soul, and now I could think of nothing but that look. I won't change your plans, I said. You're right to cast off your illusions. I only wish you'd done it before we married. I gazed at the rising crescent moon, soon to be effaced by morning sunlight. Already there was a green smear in the east. My husband spoke one last time. I promise if I find the truth, I'll bring it home to you and Rahula. I doubted his words. A minute went by, then another. Finally, the breeze shifted and the crickets resumed their refrain. Siddhartha had left, as I knew he would. He was taking the journey I'd once intended for myself. Supposedly, the moon was full the night he left. Supposedly, I slept through it all. My version of these events will not be the one told to future generations. I was all but banished from that story. It's the price I had to pay for the life I chose.
Mm. So that really invites us all in. And I think that also sets up one, and Barbara and I have been having some nice visits on Zoom, sometimes with a glass of wine. And we were talking about what the challenges and rewards are of taking a story that has myth, that everyone sort of makes assumptions, and you just heard Yasi refer to that her story is not going to be the one you hear. There's history, and there's also scripture and canon and tradition, and you've taken that on, Barbara. So what compelled you to retell it?
As have you taken it on in your novels. But yes, well, the sort of superficial reason in a way that compelled me to write it was that so many people, women in particular, were turned off by the Buddha being a man who left his wife, and now they're expected to follow him. So I thought, well, I wanted to explain that myth, or I wanted to illuminate the myth. I wanted to figure out what was going on with it. So I got more into it. And I wanted to tell it from the point of view of the person who'd been dumped, wife. I mean, I think I learned really about that myth, and from that myth, I developed an appreciation for the myth and the fact that he had to leave the wife and child. I mean, in case anyone, the basic story was that the Buddha was a prince in a palace, which he wasn't. I mean, as much as we know historically, he was the son of a clan leader. But for the sake of the myth, he was a prince in a palace, and a holy man had told his father when he was a baby, your son will either be a great holy man or he'll be a great monarch, a world-turning monarch. Well, the father wanted him to be the monarch, not the holy man. So he set up the ideal worldly life, palaces and dancing girls and landscaping and, you know, and mainly never allowing the Buddha to have any sight or sound of any sickness, death, or old people. He just lived in this youthful paradise for 29 years until one day, and there's a story around that I won't go into, he came upon a sick man, a dying man, a corpse, and a holy man, which were sometimes known as the four heavenly messengers, because the Buddha was suddenly struck with the reality of death. And suddenly the wonderful life he had turned to ash. You know, he was just stunned and broken. Well, part of his wonderful life by this time was that he had married the girl of his dreams in a way, and they had just had a son, which in a patriarchy, he had the perfect life. And so he left to become a holy man because of the pain that he'd see once he had to face this existential crisis. And what the appreciation I developed for the myth was that he had to have the best life possible. I mean, if your basic insight is going to be life, or one of your basic insights after he achieved his enlightenment, life is permeated with suffering. It is not equal to suffering, but there's a lot of suffering in it, and it's inevitable. If you're going to have that feeling, then you've got to have the best possible life, because if that life has suffering in it, every other one does too. So I really gave me a deeper appreciation of the myth. Sorry, dear. Sorry, my computer is a little uneven here. Anyway, that was what got me started. But since then, I've had, you know, people raise the issue, well, why have these myths at all? I mean, they're so full of misogyny, they're so full of patriarchy. Why even bother to try to retell the myths? Why not just tell new stories? So I thought of that, you know, I think, well, okay, there's a point there, why not? And then the analogy came to me of remodeling a house. Like a myth is like a house where millions of people are living. You know, so you really got, you know, it's got a lot of problems, it's got toxic areas, it's got, you know, walls you don't need, but it's home to a whole lot of people. And so if you were to like just tear down that house, you'd be left with like an empty hole and a lot of toxic debris and a lot of hopelessness. And so I thought, no, better to remodel the myth. Put in some new windows and doors. Let the light in, take out some walls, put in other ones maybe, and really sort of have that so people can live what they've grown with and what they know. And so their lives aren't just truncated and they have roots. So that's why I really sort of decided on, yeah, the myth is not a bad thing. I mean, knowing full well there could be bad remodels. We've lived in several houses with bad remodels. And some of the things, like the original suttas, most scholars think that a lot of the misogyny in the suttas, and there is some clear misogyny in the suttas, were later additions, particularly when it's attributed to the Buddha, partly because it's so contradictory to most of the Buddha's behavior and how he treats women in the suttas. But by the way, when I say sutta, it's the Pali word for sutra, which some people are more familiar with when they think about Buddhism, but it's the Buddhist scriptures. So anyway, that's where I started taking this stuff.
And I remember you're telling me that part of the myth, which is that he had never seen suffering before, was probably not realistic to the time, that it was more complex than that.
Right.
The other thing that we were talking, I mean, you've chosen not to have some kind of a theological argument or put forth like, well, use a different truth, like a competing truth. You've chosen to write fiction. And I know that you've told me that you've had at least one experience where somebody said, but you can't, well, you haven't revealed the big plot twist yet.
Oh, yeah.
Some of what you're doing, you're remodeling the house, but you're also reimagining and revisioning, and you're giving yourself permission and giving the reader permission to imagine things that could have happened, but you're not making a claim that they did happen. You're giving us another point of view, a really other point of view. And one of the things we were both saying that we love about reading fiction is that instead of saying, well, here's the one truth, and there is no other truth, and if you say that, you're wrong, that fiction by its very nature says, oh, well, I'm looking from this point of view, and from here, this is how it looks. And from here, this is how it looks. And fiction allows more than one way to see. So you've given us a different way to see that could have happened, but you also took some imaginative leaps.
Yes, definitely.
Speak, novelist.
Yes, and I did, and I was almost compelled. I suppose I should give away
a little, maybe a little bit. I think.
Right. I mean, what happens is the Buddha's wife eventually, decides to take her own spiritual journey anyway. After her son leaves her to become a monk, which breaks her heart, but it happens, to become a monk with his father. And so she decides she's going to go on her own spiritual quest. But she ends up, after some adventures, back at her husband's community in disguise as the historical monk, Ananda, who historically, and of course everything is back at that time. When I say history, it's pretty much one with legend. I mean, there are people actually trying to disprove the Buddhist existence. So, you know, there's not a lot of evidence for a lot outside of the suttas. So anyway, she decides to become Ananda, and who becomes, historically, so to speak.
And that's a historical character.
Yeah.
Or
right.
As historical as it gets. Yeah.
Right. And who's the one who persuades the Buddha to accept women. And why I took this leap was that when I was doing the research, all of these anomalies came out about Ananda. One of which was that here he is, a junior monk, unenlightened, and he is the monk who persuades the Buddha to admit women. Also, he's not enlightened. He's one of the few close associates of the Buddha. I think he's the only close associate of the Buddha who's not enlightened during the Buddha's lifetime. So what could explain this? Well, one way of explaining it would be he's not enlightened because he's living a life of deception. In Buddha, you can't be deceptive. And so he's not going to become enlightened. And also he has other issues which come up in the book, he, she. And the first question that he becomes that he's also so, the other idea about Ananda is that he's so committed to women's issues, not only persuading the Buddha to admit women, but also defending women a lot and doing a lot for them. And that comes up in the book. So I didn't want to do it at first, but it was so compelling. I felt this is how I have to tell her story, because I wanted to tell about a woman who did a lot in Buddhism. And there are women who have, they have done a lot for Buddhism, but somehow I was with a Buddhist wife, and this is where I went with it. And the Buddhist wife, the other interesting thing is the Buddha's wife in the suttas is not mentioned at all, very seldom. Her name is not mentioned at all. The Yasodhara comes later. She's given a name that in Pali means something like Rahula's mother. But in the suttas, she is not mentioned after she tells her son, go, Rahula, this is your father, go get your inheritance, meaning go become a monk if you need to. Learn the Dharma. But she didn't, in my novel, she didn't expect him to do it. But in the suttas, there's this hint that she might not have been very happy saying this, that she's bitter, and you never hear from her again. Now, in the tradition, there's a huge tradition. Oh, yes, Yasodhara joined the Sangha later, and she became enlightened, and all was fine. But this was much later than the early Pali Canon, which were the first scriptures of the Buddhists that were written down in the 1st century BC, and they were written down about 400 years after the Buddhist death. So it was a long time.
So it's an open invitation to a novelist. It's what in Jewish tradition would be called midrash. It's like,
Right. Yes,
there's
yeah.
a story, but what happened between those lines? And in that tradition, you're really invited to imagine. So I was thinking as you were speaking, there's a great scene in the novel where Yasi, I'm going to call her Yasi, confronts the Buddha when she finally gets to see him. She hasn't left yet, but he's come back. She finally gets an audience with him. And he gives her all these reasons for why it's impossible for her to join. You really can't have women. And you could tell it just so that you could know what his thinking. She challenges him about that in a really wonderful way, but I'll let you say what that is, because she basically challenges him of conventional thinking. So maybe you could tell us all a little bit about what the assumptions were, that why you couldn't have women. Why was that so terrible?
Well, in the actual text, some of his reasons are kind of specious, but what people interpret, lovers of the Buddha and lovers of the scriptures say, well, but the Buddha couldn't take women at first because, they were, and this is very reasonable. And I'm not even sure whether it appears in the suttas, but I do have my Buddha saying it, which is, look, we're doing something completely new here. We're admitting women, and we're doing something completely new here. We have the Sangha that is not dependent on priests and sacrifices for enlightenment. Everyone can join. It all depends on your own efforts and overcoming your own ignorance. And the Brahmins and the people of the time who depend, and the priests who are very powerful, they're going to fight us. And if we have women living and traveling with us, it's going to be extremely difficult because they're going to use that as a weapon against us.
They're going to see them as camp followers. Right,
yeah. And Yasi just doesn't buy it. She says, look, you're letting all castes in. You're letting in vulture catchers and tanners and all these lower caste people. I use Varna because it was sort of pre-caste word. But anyway, people from the lower orders are allowed to go in, men, but not women. And she said, I can't buy it.
Yeah, she said, what does she use as the word dharma? She says, that's not your dharma eyes or something like that.
Oh, right. Yeah, he says, I see. She said, I would have accepted, as Siddhartha, I would have accepted women. But now I see with the eyes of Dharma, and I see that I'm trying to do this whole new revolutionary thing of having the Sangha and of people who become enlightened on their own in a way. And I can't afford to invent women. And she said, you may have the eyes of Dharma, but they're in a human body. You're not omniscient. That's and lately he's persuaded. So he's persuaded that, I shouldn't tell all this in the book. I shouldn't give it away, but in some way he's persuaded in a certain way. Let's put it that way.
But you haven't really, what you've given away is there, which I think is a good reason to read it, is that and this is what we're just saying about novels, is that you can see from more than one point of view. There was a tension there. There was a conflict there. There was possibly even a conflict within him.
Oh yeah. I mean, again, I sort of have this, going back to this whole thing, how do you portray someone who is enlightened? In some ways it's scary and it's presumptuous. And so at a certain point, I just have to say, okay, I just have to be with whatever the Buddha is going to say here through my mind, and then, look at it and try what they call in the Jesuit tradition, discernment of spirits.
That was one of my questions. Say more. Mm-hmm.
It may be, how much of it is my own ego, my own needs, my own stories, my own emotions. How can I really be clear? And getting clear is it's more than just writing the words. It's a meditation in itself.
Yeah.
With the Buddha, and then coming back and, was I clear here? And sometimes, lots of times in the Buddha, I will use the Buddha's words, particularly when he's making pronouncements to the monks and pronouncements to Ananda. He says certain things, and I just take it pretty much out of some translation. In fact, the Buddha's last words I had two sentences because they were both translations of the same Pali sentence. And one was work for your freedom with diligence, and the other one was tread the path with care. So I thought, well, which one am I going to use? I just thought, oh, why not use both? You know, it sort of like rhythmically into the paragraph too that he used both. But that was his last. Those were his last words. And I know a lot of people think, well, his last words were "be a light unto yourselves," and he did say that. And actually, that may well appear in my novel, but it's not the very last thing he said.
So this is a question I don't think I've asked you before, but what you've just been, and you started to speak to it a little bit, which is how the book changed you. I mean, how engaging with that story and those people changed you, changed your faith, or maybe faith isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. It was transforming to you as well. It sounds like you got a little remodeled, maybe.
Oh yeah, still am. I mean, I mean, it's an ongoing process. It is not the book, and the reactions, everything continue to change me and to make me see certain things. And one of the themes of the book that emerged as I was writing it is this, the polarity in almost maybe every religion is a polarity between, love and transcendence, or, how do I love the world or love the individuals in the world and at the same time transcend the world, and Buddhism certainly has that. And the Buddha on the one hand says, if you have 100 loved ones, you will suffer 100 times more. But he also says, like, as a mother guards with her child, her only child, guards with her own life, her only child. I'm sorry, I'm garbling the quote, but with a boundless heart, this is how you should consider all beings. And there's this idea that you should have this boundless heart toward all beings. And some people say, well, it means goodwill. But, hey, love is love. It's goodwill is kind of out there. And my feeling is if you say you're guarding your life, you're guarding your only child with your life, you're saying to love all beings and to have this boundless compassion. And so there is this, and in Buddhism, the typical way of expressing this is Buddhism has two wings, the wing of wisdom and the wing of compassion. But there's always a tension there. And it's my feeling is it's not that simple when you get right down to it. And Yasodhara has that struggle because her love for her son is so deep and so personal. And she's somehow expected to expand her love for her son for all beings and transcend this life. And so I don't come down on either one side or the other. I just hold attention in myself and I hold attention in her. There's a Vedantic saying, don't tell me. If I can find the quote, and I can't find the quote. Love tells me I have everything. Wisdom tells me I am nothing. My life is a river that flows between the two.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, and so that sort of, and I've certainly, ascribed to that before I wrote the book, but it's in a much deeper way now. And the other thing that I've really felt as I've been writing this book, and during these times in particular, sort of one of the things that the Buddhists contributes to world consciousness is this idea of getting to know your own mind and getting to understand how the mind will exaggerate what you want it to exaggerate, what you think you want, and how desire and ignorance are so entwined that because we're ignorant of how things really are, we get caught up in desire, and because we're caught up in desire, we become more ignorant. And so it's this circular feedback. And I've learned more about that through my practice, but reading the book, seeing these tensions between love and wisdom and how do we work with it. So it's been a journey for me.
And one of the things that I really love about Yasi, when you were talking about she had to take her love for her son and she was supposed to make it universal, and she did something that to me would be like a middle way, is that she started paying attention to the monks around her, especially the young monks that were, some of them left there because their families couldn't afford to feed them. So her love started to expand, but it wasn't abstract. It was still very particular.
Right.
And the other thing that I love about her, unenlightened as she was, well, maybe she was unenlightened because as you say, she was living a kind of deception, which also was a kind of truth. So and this is a concept that Buddhists you make it clear, there's somebody called Mara, or a force called Mara, which maybe you'll define a little for us, that she's always like slipping up and getting tricked by. But what I loved about her is that when she's really screwing up and getting involved in things that she shouldn't, oftentimes she's doing it because she wants to right some wrong, or she's impassioned. And so that she really lives all those contradictions and paradoxes that you were just talking about. And I identify with her.
Well, in another theme in the novel is forgiveness, and how we forgive, and how that, there are layers of forgiveness, and how it's related to letting go of certain narratives, certain stories, as well as your own anger, and so that is something that continually comes up for her in terms of her, and trying to become enlightened. And I don't want to, again, giving away a lot, but that is part of the whole journey that she's on.
Well, I think we've got, I just want to make sure there's someone we need to mention. Well, and on her way to becoming a monk, she spends time with a tribal hill woman shaman, that stick woman. And that she came to my mind because she always does. But also at one point she says to Yasi, she's making her carry water and do things like that. And then she says, well, don't think you're done carrying water. And then at another point, she's really asked her to do a really intense act of forgiveness. And she does it. And then she said, well, don't think you're done forgiving. So before we open it up, stick woman was, and how she came to you. She's a wonderful part of the story.
She's come to me in several forms now, and I don't know. It's sort of, it's just possesses me in a way, and I've had to what's she doing up in the hills? I had to get it, but she had to be there. She had to do it, and I wanted to get that, talk about the love of the earth. If Yasi go the other way, where you transcend the world. First of all, she had to immerse herself in the world totally. And that shamanistic point of view, where I'm thinking of all of these religions, I say, have these poles. And I think about Christianity, they have a transcendence pole and an immanence pole, and this whole love your neighbor. And I think Christianity has this, but every of these religions have a little way of getting into these poles and seeing things uniquely. Like in Christianity, I think, Buddhism really has great things to say about love. But Christianity has this way about looking at the poor and serving the poor. And that gives you a whole different finger at the moon, and a whole different way of practicing, and a whole different way of understanding and transforming. And in the case of the shaman, they're doing the same thing with the non-human elements, animals, plants, seeing from their perspective. And so I wanted her to get fully, since there was no Christianity around, I wanted her to get fully into that idea of the earth religion, of the life religion. And so stick woman is a way of doing that. But I also wanted to make stick woman in a way a little bit, as you say, kind of off-putting. She's a little bit,
she's fierce. She's fierce. Has fierce compassion.
Yes. Uncouth. She's also got this very wry humor. Yeah. But then you see the source of where that's from. You see after a while she explains herself in a way, at the very end when they have to separate. And that again I'll leave in the book, but it explains why she is how she is.
And Yasi draws on the wisdom that she learned from her all throughout her life.
And that's other
as well.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that would just come to me when I was writing. I did not put in the outline, stick woman goes here. No, I mean, she passed these. I thought, oh God, that's all. At one point I say, it was all the Dharma she could get. All right, that's all the Dharma I could find right then. And she'd remember something, or she'd sort of channel her in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I mean, she was another thing I sort of resisted, but I couldn't. Couldn't.
Yeah, that's when you know you're onto something. And you try to resist, and you can't. Yeah. So, is there something that I haven't asked you, or that you'd like to say before it gets opened up? I think we've got 5 or 10 more minutes. What haven't I asked you? What do you want me to ask?
I know we've talked about enlightenment.
And
you was sort of off-putting.
Which is hard for non-Buddhists to understand. So have at it.
It's not. Yeah, it's really easy for me to understand. Actually, it's you can hear there's a lot of controversy in Buddhism right now about what is enlightenment. And it's one of those things, you've heard of the apophatic method, of understanding God by understanding what God is not. In some ways, with enlightenment, you could that's a good approach to take at certain points with it. It's not some mystic state, it's not a thing or an item of knowledge, and it's not a place. So you can also talk, though, about it. I've heard it defined as the realization of the reality of non-grasping, because Buddhism, the source of all craving is a source of all suffering is craving and grasping. And once you realize that you're grasping something, and you're
Are you grasping something?
Yes, I was grasping something right there. Sorry. Anyways, it's just letting go, and that's one way of describing it. It's described as sometimes it's described. And this is some Buddhists just go bananas when they hear this described. Although the Buddha calls it the deathless, the unconditioned, but this because the Buddha sees all things as conditioned, and this is part of the problem. This is why we can't identify with these conditioned things, because they're all interconnected. And so there is no solid essence of a self that we can say, oh, this is me, this is me. No, there are all these conditioned things that are always changing. But nirvana is the unconditioned, or nibbana. And that realization of the unconditioned, it literally means something like blowing out or quenching, because you're quenching this fire of desire and hatred. And once that's quenched, it's another way of looking at it. This is quoting, I think, Sylvia Boorstein. Shoot, I just lost it. The promise that peace of mind and a contented heart are not dependent on external circumstances. That you could be happy independent of external circumstances. I mean, the Buddha was in pain sometime, but he did not suffer because he did not grasp onto it and resist it. He simply was another word for enlightenment is non-reactive. He did not react. He's just, no, this is the way things are. And
right. So suffering is, if you're in pain, you're in pain, but suffering might be, well, it's not fair, and this one did this and that one did that, is the story we make up around it that makes it worse, instead of just like, yeah, I'm in pain.
Right. It's sort of thing. Pain is inevitable.
Yeah.
Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the other famous parable that most Buddhists know about, the second arrow. You get hit with an arrow, you're going to get hit with that arrow. But when you shoot yourself with the second arrow, that's when you're going, this is all wrong. This shouldn't have happened. Why is this happening? Why is this going to get worse? And of course, if once you start learning to watch yourself doing it, it becomes easier and easier. You ease. you know. I mean, I had a couple of really remarkable experiences around pain where I've been able to, I was at a doctor's office once. This does not happen to me all the time by any means, but I was at a doctor's office once and they were sticking things in my ear and it was very painful. And I had to come there and it was like 2 hours to get there and a long wait. So the doctor finally said, look, I know you're really in pain. Maybe you should come back next week. And I just said, okay, just tell me one thing. Is there a big risk of that really being harmed by what you're doing? Because it really hurts. He says, no, it's not, there's not a risk, but it's going to really hurt. I said, go for it. And I just sort of like let go. And the pain turned into pure sensation. It was the most amazing thing. It was like heat and wild energy, but not this horrible, awful suffering pain.
So that was an interpretation that you let go of.
Yeah, right. It was that second arrow. I just didn't fire it.
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes temporarily I can do it with pain and with different emotions, but as an unconditioned, I mean, as an unenlightened person, I still have a long way to go to make that permanent, if that's at all possible.
Well, I think I mean, I think that's a question that I have, and that for Buddhism, but also maybe to Christianity too. And we've talked about that a little bit. That salvation or enlightenment, I mean, to me, are like, wait, okay, I got it. I got the salvation. I got the enlightenment. Or is it much more like what you're describing? It's like, oh, I get it. And then it recedes. And then, I don't know. It's hard for me to see it as a one-time thing.
Yeah, I understand. And in certain Zen, there's a big, two schools of Zen. One is, one time only enlightenment kind of boom. The other one is gradual. Most people
like maybe,
or you try to have more and more of these experiences in a way. You have more of this letting go. There's more letting go and less holding on, less clinging.
Mm-hmm.
But still cling. I mean, and being human is, I don't know.
Well, I liked how you put it that because I think a misunderstanding that I certainly had of Buddhism it was more about, it was more about transcending and not feeling, detaching. And the way you put it, it's like there's compassion and there's also wisdom. Is that how you said it?
Yeah, the two wings of compassion.
Yeah, I had never thought of it as two-winged.
Yeah, because you can't have one without.
Back in the day, people would, get on your case for suffering because you wanted something, and I was like, I won't say what I said. But so your book was very helpful to me in showing me Buddhism through the eyes of someone who loves so passionately as you're.
Right. Yes. Well, that's part of it, because that is the whole tension. I mean, human love and what is love all about? Why are we here? And supposedly the enlightened person can only feel 4 emotions. Loving kindness can only feel 4 emotions. Loving kindness, compassion, sort of appreciative joy or sympathetic joy, and then equanimity, which sort of balances all of the others.
Wow.
And so there is this, there is a detachment there, but detachment is very different from indifference. Indifference is an aversion, like you're pushing it away and there's a self there. I don't like that. And that detachment is not that. Detachment is acceptance.
Is it called detachment or non-attachment? And is there a difference?
Either way. I think non-attachment is not, because detachment can kind of have a more connotation of indifference. But people can use it. I've heard it both ways. It's sort of, as long as you can know the distinction, that there is this distinction.
That it's not aversion.
It's not aversion. It's not this self pushing away.
Right.
That's the important thing. And then the other thing about it is that it's transformational. So you're being transformed. And in some sense, if you're thinking about a gradual awakening, you could think of, you're having experiences, you're learning non-grasping, you've got to practice, and then all of a sudden, the transformation can happen, like century plants or something, they shoot up. But I don't know. I rest in what they call don't know mind, as far as happen this way? Are there people enlightened today? Is it a permanent state? There are some people who say the only thing that enlightenment is simply not being reactive, not having the touching, having resisting. And that's enlightenment. And
that is something for, oh, here we go. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Please.
I was just going to say it's something that I think a lot of us need to learn in our times. We live in very reactive times. So everybody buy the book.
Well, actually, I just wanted to mention to our audience members out there, so it's about time to head to questions and answers if we're going to do that this evening, although I'm honestly like taking notes of, okay, let go of your anger. Like I'm learning so much for this, so thank you both so much. So I just wanted to say to our audience members out there, if you have any questions, now would be the time to answer or to enter them into the chat module. But in the meantime, do you mind, both of you, if I ask you a couple questions?
Go for it.
Awesome. So I want to ask the question that was brought up before we entered the event, which is, you're two women who have written these novels kind of retelling major world religions. What issues have you run into? What blowback, if any?
I had some trouble with the gender switch, people with feminists saying, well, you should be writing about women. And I couldn't quite, figure out why. She's still a woman, but they wanted this sort of purity of a conventional woman. So I got, it wasn't major, but I got some of that. And then I once ran into a Buddhist scholar, a woman scholar, who I mentioned the premise of the book, the gender switch. Well, surely that didn't happen in the scriptures. And I said, no, this is fiction. This is a novel, So, and then the basic blowback of, why do we have these myths anyway? Why not just start over? And that I tried to address earlier. What about you, Elizabeth?
Oh, I've had that conversation. This is fiction many times, because I've gotten it from both the, from the conservative side and from the New Age side, whereas, the way I've envisioned it couldn't possibly have happened because it's not in the scriptures and it's not in the Bible. And also it couldn't have happened that way because so-and-so channeled Mary Magdalene and this is not what happened. I thought, well,
no.
I mean, it's kind of come from both sides. I think the most controversial thing I did, which I find people who have actually read the books don't have any issues with it, but she came to me as a 20th century character who was a peace prostitute. And she would not be in any of the books I proposed until I said, well, what about the Celtic Mary Magdalene? So people get very angry about any suggestion from anyone nowadays that she could have ever had any time as a prostitute, because they want to see her as the bride of Christ or the chief apostle. And they feel like the Pope that made it up, and they don't. But my issue is like, well, wait, what if she wasn't repentant? What if she wasn't penitent? And my feeling is, if people are like feminists and religious people like are pulling back their skirts and saying, no, she cannot be depicted that way, then, well, she and I wanted to depict her that way, because how can you be a feminist or a Christian and draw yourself back from that? So to me, there was juice there and there was power there. And I've had a lot of blowback, except from the people that have actually read the book and they get it.
And I highly recommend the book, by the way. Absolutely. You really, your Christianity will be enhanced. She's a prostitute, but she's so much more.
And she has many other. She's got 4 books.
Yeah,
so she's the daughter of Celtic weather witches, and it's pretty wild. It's wild, but she and Lucy are really good friends. They're both pretty wild.
Yeah,
daring.
Yeah, it's funny. I have not gotten any blowback either from anyone who's actually read the book. All the blog is just the idea of it.
The idea.
I think there's this need for respectability. You know, I mean, like, okay, you want to remodel the house? Well, no, you can't do this. You just have to add a coat of paint, maybe, but not really say, okay, no, we really need to break this wall out and put in this. And, you know,
don't put any new windows in.
Right.
And I really like what you said, Elizabeth, at the beginning of like that is kind of like the use of fiction, is those multiple perspectives. I'm sorry, were you saying something else? Oh, sorry.
No, well, I think the thing I get about fiction, and I like the book, first of all, having the other points of view, being able to get out of your own self. We haven't talked about that a whole lot in this, but the whole purpose of all of the religions, if they have something in common, it's getting out of the prison of the self, of the separated person, grasping self. And fiction helps you do that by developing empathy, by getting into other people's points of view. And that's something else I was going to say there. Now I can't remember what it was. What was the question? I forget. But, sort of pointing out, and just related to that, giving you other possibilities of being, you know, of living, of feeling, of understanding what is respectable and what isn't respectable. I mean, I think something like fiction without, you know, it presents the possibilities. And I think that's so important, especially now when people are so polarized. And
some things that people believe are true are absolutely, like, I would never even be able to imagine that. But I think we have, although people still read novels and go to movies, I think we don't really understand story and myth very well, what its function is. Because it's like, is this true or is this not true? Is this made up or is this not? And really fiction, as I think the way Barbara and I are both approaching it, it's not fact and it's not what people think of as fiction, as in untrue. It's mythopoetic truth, and it's a truth rather than the truth. It's the truth of the imagination. And I don't think we understand imagination very well. I mean, people, like I say, all the conspiracy theories, I think, are wildly imaginative, but people need to believe that they're fact. Is there like
literalism? Yes. Yeah. Or truth of the heart. You know, I mean, the thing about it's that subjective aspect of truth. I mean, you know, that is important, and it's important to know when it functions and where it functions. You know, I mean, I am a great believer in science, but I'm also a believer in the kind of subjective truth that you find from a myth, or you find from fiction or poetry or even memoirs.
Some science are mystics too, because
I know
that place of not knowing, that place of mystery.
I know there's so much in science that is mind blowing. I mean, I've been reading about the fractions of the second that happened during the first second of the Big Bang.
Wow.
And they're like trillions of a second, such and such happened. What? I mean, they're beyond the mind. So
that's amazing.
In my mother's house, there are many mansions.
That's good, Barbara. In my mother's house, there are many mansions. Yeah.
And so we only have a few minutes left, but I was hoping that kind of to end out our evening, maybe you both could talk a little bit about your own different writing processes, and maybe even mention a few authors that have inspired you during your careers as writers.
Oh,
go, Barbara.
Well, I mean, the word that comes right out now is like Toni Morrison. I think she really deals a lot in objectivity and also sort of a mythological point of view. And she's really influenced me, you know, sort of like the scriptures and Shakespeare and Joyce Carol Oates, who has this very rich way of looking at realism, you know, on that pole of reality. It's so hard to really.
What about your process, Barbara? What's your process?
My process is, I'm embarrassed about my process. My process is sitting down anytime I have a chance and writing. And I wish I could say every morning at 9 I get up and write for 3 hours. No, I squeeze it in wherever I can. And sometimes I have certain things that I'm always revising. And so even if I'm not inspired, I can go to the revision and work on the revision.
That's good.
That's a good method.
Yeah. So that. How about you? You've
Well,
done a lot.
I do write in the morning, but there's lots of ways to procrastinate, including writing. I have ways that I write in which I procrastinate. I think I've always done that, and I've always had other jobs that were in the afternoon or evening that always suited me. And I started out writing in spiral notebooks on every other line, scribbling in margins and crossing things out. And I had a creed: if you can't read it, you don't need it. And then email came along, and I can't type. I type with 2 fingers, but I type, and I got used to composing on the keyboard, and I do that now, which means that I make many, many, many more typos because I'm revising as I go. And the typos, every book has more typos. But my favorite thing about process is that I had a dream once where I was on stage and I sat down and I wrote a few words, and then I got up and I went to the bathroom, and then I did this and then I did that, and then I sat down and I wrote a few more words and I crossed them out, and then there was 2 crossed out pages and I held them up and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, believe it or not, this is how books get written." So
I love that so much.
yeah.
Yes.
And I have to say, I really like your influences, Barbara. I think that, and this might not sound so good, but my biggest influence, I think, still is C.S. Lewis.
Oh no,
because of the Narnia books and his other fiction, because he was writing things that always had magic in them, but were sort of always very grounded in the sensual real world.
Yeah, that is where, just that proportion of magic or fantasy and reality. The proportion, that's a whole other discussion of the use of the supernatural. Because you and I use it somewhat differently.
I forgot to ask you, you wanted me to ask you, how come Yasi can't see the ghosts? And that's a big deal in the book.
Yeah, well, partly because of the times that it was being written. The Buddhist was born and lived in what they call an axial period, where sort of everything was up for grabs. Vedic religion, it was late in the Vedic religion, and people were questioning the priests and the rituals, and the Jains were another movement that was coming into being, and there were nihilists, people that believed in absolutely nothing, and all these holy men were wandering around, and some holy women too, from house to house, and people would support them because it was considered a respectable thing to do, even heroic. I mean, so there was this whole idea that, you couldn't depend on the old gods anymore. You couldn't depend on the old religion. Also, there seems to have been the idea that you really couldn't depend on happiness of life anymore. I mean, there was Richard Gombrich has a theory that there was more disease back then than there had been in the previous era, because there was more urbanization, and also the way the civilization was moving into the Ganges Valley, there was more. The agriculture was happening in a more humid, wetter environment, so there were more mosquitoes, more people were getting sick that way. So people were suffering more. And so all of this question, but this was happening happening in China, it was happening in the Middle East, where people were going, Yahweh, why have you done this to me all of a sudden? The book of Job. I mean,
is that the same time period? Probably?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah, all of this kind of questioning of the old ways. And so I also wanted to make Yahweh a modern person. I mean, not Yahweh. I mean,
Yahweh.
Yahweh too.
Yeah,
Sure.
Yahweh. Yeah.
To relate to people who don't have mystical experiences, who don't have that, don't have their old built-in gods, and their God app works completely differently. So I wanted to have that viewpoint, in the forefront, so that you can see the clarity of Buddhism. You don't need a lot of mystical stuff. That's my view. Some people say you do, but my view is you don't need it. I mean, I'm not saying that mystical stuff is untrue or it's not good. It's just that I think brains work in very different ways. And I think the Buddha knew that, at least the way I portray him, he did, yeah, some people see this reality. Some people see reality that's different.
Good.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your multiple perspectives and your insight into your writing. This has been a great conversation to follow. And thank you to our audience members out there for joining us this evening. Barbara, congratulations on your book, and I hope you both have a wonderful evening. Do you have any parting words?
I thank you very much to allow us to do this, Oblong Books. And buy your books at Oblong Books.
Yes, thank you, Oblong. Thank you, independent bookstores. Thank you, Monkfish. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Monkfish.
Thank you, Leif. Yeah.
And thank you too, Elizabeth. You've been a fantastic host this evening. So
yes, thank you, Elizabeth.
Well, my pleasure.
It's been such a pleasure. I hope you both have a wonderful evening.
Yes, you too.
You too.
And we'll see you soon, Barbara. We'll go on having our chats.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody. I don't know how to actually turn this off, but
I've got you covered.
Okay.
Good night.